Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey squinted against the glare of the Pacific sun, his eyes burning from salt spray and exhaustion. Below him, nothing but endless blue ocean stretched in every direction. His fuel gauge hovered dangerously close, to empty. 15 Douglas SBD. Dauntless dive bombers followed in formation behind him, each pilot knowing what McCluskey knew. They were running out of time to find the Japanese fleet. If they failed, they would have to ditch in the ocean, assuming they had enough fuel to make it back to their carrier at all. "Where are they?" he muttered to himself, scanning the horizon. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable. Now, on this fateful morning of June 4th, 1942, everything hinged on finding them. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned America. In the months that followed, the rising sun had swept across the Pacific virtually unchallenged. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen. The Imperial Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, seemed invincible with its 6 fleet carriers projecting power across the vast Pacific. American morale had been sustained only by the daring Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, but even that had been little more than a symbolic gesture, causing minimal damage. Now Yamamoto had set his sights on Midway Atoll, a tiny but critical American outpost just over 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. His plan was brilliant in its audacity: lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them once and for all, removing any threat to Japanese dominance in the Pacific. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had broken the Japanese Naval Code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew precisely what was coming. With only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after being damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, Nimitz resolved to set an ambush of his own. The New York Times would later call it the most important naval battle of the Pacific War, noting that it represented the strategic turning point that altered the balance of naval power in the Pacific. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Richard Best awoke before dawn aboard the USS Enterprise. At 32 years old, the commander of Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, had already seen more combat than most pilots twice his age. As he prepared for the mission, he checked his lucky charm, a small medallion his wife had given him before he shipped out. "Today's going to be different," he told his wingman. "Today we're going to find them before they find us." Across the ready room, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron briefed the pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8 from the USS Hornet. A serious, intense Sioux Indian from South Dakota, Waldron had a premonition about the coming battle. "I don't want any of you to think that you're going to come back from this," he told his men solemnly. "This is our job. If we don't get them, I don't want anyone to come back." The men sat in silence, absorbing his words. Ensign George Gay, the youngest pilot in the squadron, felt a chill despite the tropical heat. Meanwhile, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Japanese Carrier Striking Force, launched his first wave of attacks against Midway Island itself shortly after 4:30 a.m. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the spearhead of the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. As his bombers disappeared over the horizon, he remained supremely confident. Intelligence reports indicated the American carriers were still near Hawaii, far from the impending battle. He was wrong. At that very moment, 3 American carriers lurked just over the horizon, their planes warming up on the flight decks. The American and Japanese forces were on a collision course, neither fully aware of the other's strength or position. As the pilots climbed into their cockpits, they knew only one thing for certain: the outcome of the Pacific War might well be decided in the next few hours. The morning air was thick with tension as wave after wave of American aircraft launched from the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Spread across miles of ocean and flying at different speeds and altitudes, the American strike force lacked coordination, a potentially fatal flaw against the disciplined Japanese defenses. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander Waldron, was the first to locate the Japanese fleet. Breaking away from the Hornet's air group, Waldron trusted his instincts rather than his orders. "If you go your way, and I go mine," he had told the air group commander before takeoff, "I'll get to the Japanese carriers before you do." His intuition proved tragically accurate. At approximately 9:20 a.m., Waldron's 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers approached the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. What followed was one of the most courageous and doomed attacks in naval history. From official Japanese naval records recovered after the war, we now know that Torpedo 8's approach was detected well before they reached attack position, wrote historian Gordon Prang in his definitive account, Miracle at Midway. The Japanese combat air patrol was vectored directly into their path. The results were devastating. 0 fighters swarmed the slow, vulnerable Devastators. One by one, they were shot down in flames. Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his comrades fell from the sky. Soon, his was the only aircraft left skimming, just above the wave tops in a desperate attempt to reach launching position. Gay released his torpedo at the carrier Kaga, then pulled up sharply, only to be hit by anti-aircraft fire and forced to ditch in the ocean. Floating among the wreckage, he would become the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. All 15 planes were lost, and only Gay survived among the 30 men who had taken off from the Hornet that morning. Similar fates awaited Torpedo Squadron, 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron, 3 from the Yorktown. In all, 35 of the 41 American torpedo planes that attacked that morning were shot down without scoring a single hit. Admiral Nagumo, watching from the bridge of the Akagi, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The American attack had been repulsed with minimal effort. What he didn't realize was that Waldron and his men had not died in vain. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons produced 2 critical developments. First, the Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to wave top, level to intercept the torpedo bombers, leaving the skies above the carriers undefended. Second, the evasive maneuvers performed by the Japanese carriers disrupted their plans to launch a counterstrike against the American carriers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching fruitlessly for the Japanese fleet. With fuel running low, he faced a difficult decision: turn back or press on. That's when he noticed a lone Japanese destroyer moving at full speed across the ocean. Where's that ship going in such a hurry? He wondered. Making a split-second decision that would change the course of the war, McCluskey altered course to follow the destroyer's wake. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the Yorktown's dive bombers on their own search. Like McCluskey, they had nearly reached the point of no return when fate intervened. At precisely the most vulnerable moment for the Japanese carriers, with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, the American dive bombers appeared in the skies above them. As one Japanese officer would later recall, "We looked up to see the black dots falling from the sky. It was 3 minutes past 10 in the morning, on June 4th, 1942. The fate of the Pacific war hung in the balance. 3 miles above the Japanese fleet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his SBD Dauntless dive bombers into position. Below him, clearly visible now, were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the carriers Akagi and Kaga. To the northeast, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown had simultaneously found the carrier Soryu. "Attack targets below," McCluskey radioed, then rolled his aircraft into a steep dive. What followed was 5 minutes that changed the course of World War II. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the 2nd Division of Enterprise dive bombers, watched as McCluskey's division headed for the Kaga. Making a split-second decision, he redirected his planes toward the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. The Americans had achieved complete surprise. The Japanese combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, scrambled to climb back to altitude, but they were too late. The sound of the diving American planes prompted a Japanese lookout on the Akagi to shout, "Hell divers!" as Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack who was grounded on the Akagi with appendicitis that day, later wrote, "The terrifying scream of the diving planes reached me first, followed by the crashing explosion of a direct hit. Lieutenant Ao. Best's bomb was particularly devastating. His 1,000-pound bomb crashed through the flight deck of the Akagi near the midship elevator and detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft below. Within moments, the carrier's flight deck became an inferno. According to studies published in the Naval Institute Proceedings, the American dive bombers achieved an extraordinary hit rate of nearly 25% during those crucial minutes, far exceeding the typical 5% rate expected in carrier operations, noted military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison. Simultaneously, bombs rained down on the Kaga and Soryu. The Kaga took at least 4 direct hits, which ignited her fuel lines and ammunition stores. Secondary explosions ripped through her hangar deck. The Soryu suffered 3 bomb hits that transformed her wooden flight deck into a mass of flames. Within minutes, for the Japanese sailors, the attack seemed to come from nowhere. One moment they were preparing to launch their own strike against the American carriers. The next, they were fighting for their lives amid blazing aircraft and exploding bombs. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, diving through thick anti-aircraft fire, vividly recalled the scene below. The deck of the carrier was a mass of flames, and her sides were surrounded by an immense spout of water from near misses. We could see the crews of Japanese ships abandoning them and leaping into the water. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in stunned disbelief as 3 of his 4 carriers were transformed into floating infernos. The carefully planned Japanese offensive had collapsed in minutes. His flagship was crippled beyond repair, her communication systems destroyed, her engines failing. By late afternoon, he would be forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Only the carrier, Hiryu, operating several miles to the north, escaped the initial American onslaught. Her commander, Captain Tomeo Kaku, immediately launched a counterstrike against the American carriers. At 12:20 p.m., Japanese dive bombers found the Yorktown and scored 3 hits, severely damaging the American carrier. But damage control teams worked miracles, and within an hour, the Yorktown was again able to launch and recover aircraft. Lieutenant Best, having returned to the Enterprise after his successful attack on the Akagi, was immediately ordered back into the air. His new target, the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. As the afternoon wore on, American search planes located the Hiryu. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown struck her with 4 bombs, turning her into a blazing wreck. By sunset on June 4th, what had been the most powerful carrier force in the world lay in ruins. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were ablaze and sinking. The backbone of Japan's naval aviation had been broken. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force, chose not to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet into the gathering darkness. The risk of Japanese submarine attack was too great, and America had already won an incredible victory. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was stained with oil slicks where 4 mighty Japanese carriers had once prowled. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all were gone, along with 322 aircraft and over 5,000 trained sailors and airmen. Japan's naval air arm, the force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been crippled in a single day. The cost for America had been high, but acceptable by comparison. The carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond were lost, along with 147 aircraft and 307 men. Among those lost were the brave pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had sacrificed themselves in the opening phase of the battle. For Lieutenant Richard Best, the victory came with a personal price. During the battle, he had inhaled caustic fumes from a faulty oxygen canister. The damage to his lungs would end his flying career and plague him for the rest of his life. Yet he had achieved what few pilots ever would. He had personally helped change the course of a global conflict. I interviewed Best in 1975 for the U.S. Naval Institute Oral History Program. Historian John Lundstrom later wrote, "Despite the physical toll the war had taken on him, he spoke with remarkable clarity about those crucial moments above the Japanese fleet. I knew we had done something important, he told me, but none of us realized at that moment just how much the world had changed." Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey also paid a price for his leadership. Wounded during the battle, he would recover to fight again, but the strain of combat command aged him visibly. His decision to follow that lone Japanese destroyer, the moment that historian Walter Lord would later call the most important decision of the entire Pacific War, haunted him with its implications. What if he had turned back? The survivors returned to Pearl Harbor as heroes, but the celebrations were muted. Too many empty bunks on the returning carriers reminded everyone of the cost. When Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was brought aboard the Enterprise after being rescued, hardened sailors wept at the sight of him. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood immediately the significance of what had happened. Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged, he told reporters. But privately, he knew it was more than revenge. It was salvation. Had Midway fallen and the American carriers been destroyed, Hawaii itself might have been next. The Japanese leadership struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. Emperor Hirohito was not officially informed of the full extent of the disaster for several weeks. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, reportedly said quietly upon hearing the news, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." For Japan, the strategic implications were devastating. In a war predicated on quick victory before America's industrial might could be brought to bear, they had lost their offensive capability just when they needed it most. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed to the Americans, never to return. According to documents declassified in the 1970s and cited in the Pacific Historical Review, military analyst Robert Cressman noted, the Japanese Navy's own assessment concluded that Midway was the turning point in the tide of war, a defeat of such proportions that it is beyond our power to recover. For the pilots who had delivered this victory, there was little time to reflect. The war was far from over, and bloody battles lay ahead at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, but none would have the strategic significance of what they had accomplished on that June day near a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific. As historian John Keegan would later write, Midway was not just a decisive battle in the narrow sense, of determining which side could attack and which defend. It was decisive in the larger sense that it determined whether Japan could continue the war on its own terms. The American public, still reeling from 6 months of defeats, embraced the Sioux victory eagerly. Newsreel footage, carefully edited to protect operational security, showed cheering sailors and returning aircraft. What the footage didn't show was the grim calculation behind the success. The willingness of men like Waldron and his torpedo bombers to fly into almost certain death. In the aftermath of Midway, military analysts on both sides scrambled to understand exactly how America had achieved such a stunning victory against overwhelming odds. While luck certainly played a role, as it does in all battles, the tactical brilliance of the American dive bomber pilots deserved particular attention. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber emerged as the unexpected hero of Midway. Considered somewhat outdated even in 1942, these aircraft delivered the knockout punch that the more modern torpedo bombers could not. The reason lay partly in tactics and partly in technology. The SBD may not have been the fastest or most advanced aircraft in the American inventory, wrote aviation historian Barrett Tillman in his definitive work, The Dauntless in World War. But it possessed 3 critical qualities: accuracy, ruggedness, and range. The American dive bombing technique, refined through years of practice, was a thing of lethal beauty. Approaching at 15,000 feet, the Dauntless pilots would roll inverted, then pull through into a steep dive of 70 to 80 degrees. A perforated dive flap extended automatically to stabilize the aircraft and prevent it from exceeding its maximum diving speed. The pilot would aim through a telescopic sight, release the bomb at about 1,500 feet, then pull out of the dive with crushing G-forces that sometimes caused pilots to black out momentarily. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's experience illustrated both the precision and the challenges of this technique. During his approach to the Japanese fleet, Leslie discovered that his plane's bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned. Undeterred, He continued his dive on the carrier Soryu, manually releasing his bomb at precisely the right moment. His hit was one of 3 that doomed the carrier. The Combat Information Bulletin published by the Navy in 1943 detailed Leslie's remarkable improvisation, noted historian Craig Simons. His quick thinking exemplified the initiative that gave American pilots an edge, despite the Japanese advantage in aircraft performance. The human factor proved decisive. While Japanese naval aviation training produced exceptional pilots, their training regimen emphasized individual skill over tactical flexibility. American pilots, by contrast, were taught to improvise and adapt to rapidly changing combat situations. Lieutenant Richard Best's decision to redirect his division to attack the Akagi when he saw McCluskey's planes heading for the Kaga exemplified this flexibility. No order was given. Best simply recognized the tactical opportunity and seized it. That decision, made in seconds, helped ensure that 2 carriers were hit simultaneously, overwhelming Japanese damage control capabilities. The battle also demonstrated the importance of leadership at all levels. McCluskey, Leslie, Best, and Waldron were not simply pilots. They were tactical commanders who had to make split-second decisions while under intense pressure. Their ability to maintain situational awareness while flying combat missions set them apart. Admiral Nimitz recognized this when he awarded Distinguished Service Crosses to the air group commanders. In the final analysis, he wrote in his after-action report, the outcome rested on the decisions made by squadron and division leaders in the air, often without communication with higher command. Intelligence played a crucial role as well. The breaking of the Japanese naval code by Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had given Nimitz the strategic information he needed to position his carriers. But tactical intelligence during the battle itself was often fragmentary or misleading. One of the most remarkable aspects of the American victory was that it was achieved despite significant command and control problems. Radio communications between aircraft were often garbled or non-existent. Different squadrons arrived over the target area at different times rather than in a coordinated strike. The torpedo bomber attacks and dive bomber strikes were not intentionally coordinated. Their timing was largely coincidental. From documents in the National Archives analyzed in the 1990s, military historian Jonathan Parshall observed, "We now understand that many of the coordination failures at Midway were actually blessings in disguise. The piecemeal nature of the American attacks overwhelmed Japanese defensive measures in ways a perfectly coordinated strike might not have." By evening on June 5th, as rescue operations continued and damage assessments were compiled, one fact was already clear: naval warfare had changed forever. The decisive engagement had been fought between ships that never came within sight of each other. The aircraft carrier, not the battleship, was now the capital ship of modern navies. For the pilots who had delivered this victory, those who survived and those who didn't, Midway would forever define their service. They had faced overwhelming odds and prevailed. In doing so, they had not only changed the course of the Pacific War, but had also written a new chapter in the history of naval warfare. In the weeks following the Battle of Midway, as the full magnitude of the American victory became apparent, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, summed up its significance in a report to President Roosevelt. Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence bravely and wisely applied, and of air attack pressed home by carrier-based planes with skill, determination, and courage. The ripple effects of those 5 crucial minutes when American dive bombers changed the course of the Pacific War would continue long after the last smoke had cleared from the horizon. For the families of Torpedo Squadron 8, the cost was immeasurable. 29 of the 30 men who flew into battle that morning did not return. Their sacrifice became emblematic of the war's brutal arithmetic. Lives traded for time, time traded for strategic advantage. When news reached the American public, the squadron's fate became a rallying cry. War bond drives, recruitment posters, and newsreels all featured their story. The name Torpedo 8 entered American mythology almost immediately, wrote historian Ronald Spector in his analysis published in the Journal of Military History. They represented the transition from defeat to victory, from Pearl Harbor to the ultimate triumph that would follow. For the surviving pilots like Lieutenant Richard Best and Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the battle's aftermath brought both recognition and challenges. Best's career ended due to his lung injury, forcing him into retirement by 1944. McCluskey continued to serve, eventually rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. Yet both men, like many veterans, found that civilians could never fully comprehend what had transpired in those critical moments above the Japanese fleet. We interviewed Admiral McCluskey in his later years. Historian John Lundstrom noted in The First Team his definitive account of U.S. naval aviation in 1942. He remained modest about his role, insisting that he was simply doing his job. Anyone would have made the same decision, he told us, though history suggests otherwise. Tactically, Midway accelerated the evolution of carrier warfare. The vulnerabilities exposed during the battle, particularly in command and control, fighter direction and damage control, led to rapid improvements in U.S. naval aviation. By 1944, American carrier task forces operated with a level of coordination and effectiveness that would have seemed impossible in early 1942. Strategically, Midway's impact was even more profound. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had planned to extend its defensive perimeter to Midway, and perhaps even Hawaii, was instead forced onto the defensive. Within 2 months, Allied forces would land at Guadalcanal, beginning the long island hopping campaign that would eventually bring American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. According to recently declassified strategic assessments from 1943 found in the National Archives, military historian H.P. Wilmot wrote, American planners estimated that the Midway victory advanced the Pacific War timetable by at least a year, possibly saving hundreds of thousands of lives that would have been lost in a more protracted conflict. For Japan, Midway represented not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe. Beyond the material losses, 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups, the psychological impact was devastating. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese arms since December 7, 1941, had been shattered. Moreover, the loss of so many experienced pilots and maintenance crews created a training deficit from which the Japanese naval air forces would never recover. Admiral Yamamoto, who had warned that Japan could not win a prolonged war against America's industrial might, saw his worst fears confirmed. Having gambled on delivering a knockout blow at Midway, he now faced the prospect of a war of attrition that Japan could not possibly win. In America, the victory provided a crucial morale boost at a time when little else was going right. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and at a time when German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate in the Atlantic, Midway showed that the Axis powers could be beaten. President Roosevelt, while careful not to reveal the intelligence advantage that had made the victory possible, made sure the American public understood its significance. The New York Times editorial the week after Midway captured the national mood, noted political historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. It stated simply, "The rising sun has passed its zenith." For naval strategists worldwide, Midway confirmed what a few visionaries had long argued. The age of the battleship was over. Aircraft carriers, naval aviation, and the pilots who flew from pitching decks into combat would dominate the seas for generations to come. When the war ended in 1945, the men of Midway, those who survived, returned to a nation eager to move forward. Many, like Richard Best, rarely spoke of their experiences. Others, like George Gay of Torpedo 8, found themselves reluctant celebrities, asked to recount their ordeal at war bond rallies and civic events. In the decades that followed, as classified documents were released and Japanese accounts became available, historians gained a fuller understanding of just how pivotal those few minutes over the Japanese fleet had been. The battle has been studied at war colleges worldwide as a textbook example of how intelligence, courage, leadership, and yes, luck combine on the field of battle. Today, more than 80 years later, the legacy of those American pilots lives on in the tactics, traditions, and ethos of naval aviation. On the wall of the ready room aboard every American aircraft carrier, a simple plaque bears the date, June 4, 1942. Below it, a quote from Admiral Nimitz, "They had no right to win, yet they did, and in doing so, they changed the course of a war. 4. The pilots who flew into history that day, McCluskey, Best, Waldron, Gay, and dozens more whose names are remembered primarily by their families and fellow naval aviators. Midway was not about grand strategy or geopolitics. It was about doing their duty in the face of daunting odds. In those few critical minutes high above the Pacific, their skill, courage, and sacrifice altered the course of world history. As President Roosevelt told the nation in a fireside chat later that summer, the victory was not won by one department or one service or one man. It was won by the United States of America. But those who know the full story of Midway understand that ultimately it came down to a handful of pilots who, in 5 fateful minutes, delivered what historian John Keegan called the most decisive blow in the history of naval warfare.